Happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome to Bold Leaders in Learning. I'm Brandon Busteed, president of University Partners of Kaplan. And as many of you know today, I'm boldly going where I have never gone before on this show and have invited my boss, Andrew Rosen, who's the chairman and CEO of Kaplan, to join me today. In all honesty, I'm really excited to have him on the show and have this conversation. And he and I were joking that in many respects, the conversation we're going to have today about the future of higher education is pretty much consistent with what we do on our bi-weekly calls together, is talking about the future of higher education. So we're going to kind of let you inside of that discussion today. And Andy, thanks for joining. We're coming up on the 10th, almost 10th anniversary of your book, Change.edu. And so, you know, obviously we're going to spend most of the time talking about that, reflections on what you said there, predictions that have or haven't come true. But I think it would be great to just start with a quick, understanding of your own background. You've been at Kaplan for a long time. Tell us a little bit about your career and trajectory. Anniversary of your book.
Yeah,
Change.
well, I should start with my college, because you and I went to the same school. We're both Duke guys. I went on to law school, and after that, I clerked for a judge for a year. And while I was clerking, I decided I did not want to go to a law firm, and I looked around and managed somehow to find a great role as a lawyer with the Washington Post, the newspaper, and that was an incredible experience. And from there, I ended up going to Newsweek as a lawyer. Newsweek is owned by the Washington Post company at the time, and spent 4 years at Newsweek as a lawyer before flipping over to Kaplan, which also was and continues to be owned by Washington Post company or its successor company, Graham Holdings. So I've been at Kaplan for a long time. I've been at the Graham Holdings company and Washington Post company for even longer.
Yeah, it's amazing. I know I've heard you say it before, but you feel like you've had many different careers, and yet, technically speaking, have worked for the same organization for most of that. And it's true, the broad, diverse, global nature of Kaplan and the various other companies that are part of the Graham Holdings. It's fascinating. There's never a dull moment. There's always something new to learn. So
yeah,
that's
Kaplan
been
has
exciting
changed
too.
so much over the years. I mean, when I started, there was a tiny money-losing test prep company, and it's now a big, broad, global brand that people know just as well in Singapore or Australia or New Zealand, or throughout Asia and Africa, as well as people might know it in Boston or Washington, D.C.
Yeah, so we'll come back at the end and maybe catch up on a couple other Kaplan updates. But I want to turn back to Change.edu. 10 years since the book, got a lot of great reviews when it came out, and there were a lot of predictions about the future. Why don't you just catch us up, though, on kind of your summary of what's happened in the last 10 years across higher ed?
Well, yeah, a quick summary of what's happened. I mean, so much has happened in higher ed over the course of the last 10 years. One thing I would specifically note is when I was writing the book, people really associated online learning with the for-profit sector. There was not, in fact, the traditional higher education system was largely, not exclusively, but largely hostile to the notion that you could educate a student online. It was the criticism was pretty withering, and so when you think about how far we've come over the course of the last decade, it's quite remarkable, because even if online isn't embraced by everyone, it is certainly accepted by everyone, I would say, in American higher ed. And that's a big change. But if I think about what's happened in the last 10 years, you really got to focus first on what's happened in the last 8 months, because I don't think any of us, and we've talked about this, Brand, I don't think any of us could have imagined that America's higher ed system could make a change, really fundamentally changing its educational model and its business model in what amounted to a week. I mean, for most, basically over spring break.
Yeah.
And I think actually what the higher ed system did was remarkable. I mean, it's interesting because the sort of public perception sometimes, and certainly within the trade press, it's all about what went wrong, and Zoom U, and things were not perfect. It's not this. It's not exactly the same. And what about my dining hall program? And so you're talking about taking away the core of what schools have thought of as their environment in instantly and shifting to an entirely new modality. And faculty made that change, and administrators
Right.
made that change, and tech support made that change. I think it's just a fantastic story about what American higher ed is capable of. And if I were the president of a university, I would be spending every day talking to my faculty, my administration, and saying, "Look what you did. Look how fantastic this is. Can we bottle this up and keep doing it?" Like,
Right.
if we could have the same level of energy and innovation and adaptivity on an ongoing basis that we've had over the last 8 months, American higher ed would be off the charts. So I think what we saw just in the last 8 months is what the system is capable of, and I'm hoping, and I think there's some reason to think that it will look a little more like the rapidly changing, nimble environment that we've just seen, as opposed to the slower moving, system that people often talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought it up because in asking about the last decade, you can put a lot into the last 8 months, right? And to think
Yeah.
too about you and I've talked about this a little bit as well. All the innovation that's happening on what I'll call a micro level as well, like in the classroom, right? Zoom, whatever the framework is, right? Between faculty and students, the ways that necessity, right, is the mother of all invention kind of thing, right? We were forced into this, but then to see the innovation. Simple examples. I interviewed a faculty member on this show a couple of weeks ago who just basically created her own new software platform to enhance communication so it feels like a real classroom, right? And she did it because she wanted that to happen in her classroom. So she just made it, right? And then, one of our favorite folks that many people know at Duke, Tony Brown, he's teaching on Zoom, but he's so excited because now he's able to bring alumni into his classes, multiple alumni into the conversation, where before he'd have to have them book it as a travel schedule, fly down to campus, all that kind of stuff like that. So I just sprinkle a few of these things in to say that you're right. It is amazing to see this, right? Although there have been some downsides to it and lots of complaints, this is the time to kind of hold that innovation up as something to really encourage more of, and to not, this expression of, getting back to normal or the new normal. For higher ed, I don't know that we should have the goal of getting back to normal, right? Was normal always that great? So, as a segue, right, you made a lot of predictions in Change.edu. In fact, you were forecasting out a good 25 years in the book. You talked about what you called the 7 certainties in the last chapter of the book. I could maybe give you a grade, my own report card, but I'm hesitant to do that with my boss. I would love you to tell us, where did you nail it? What things might you have missed reflecting on it now, and some of those things obviously another 15 years out may still be very viable, but what's your sense of your prediction on that?
Yeah, I didn't project over 25 years because I was trying to punt on the issue, but because higher ed does evolve over an extended period of time. Uh, in fact, a couple weeks ago when Apple came out with the iPhone 12, like the next day, I saw an article saying, "Here's what's expected in the iPhone 13." I'm like, man, oh man, like that's not how higher ed typically operates. It's like very methodical. Let's get one foot in front of the other. Um, but over time, it does change. And really, the heart of my book was an historical look at higher ed, and a look at how the various sectors of higher ed emerged. Uh, started really, the book starts in 1636 with the founding of Harvard, and goes all the way through, the traditional schools, and then land grant schools, and the innovation and the hostility towards land grant schools, and then the evolution of community colleges, and what the model is and what the incentives are for each of these sectors, and then the for-profit sector. And what I was trying to convey is uh, higher education has a rich history of innovation, but it happens over the fullness of time. And so the 7 certainties that we talked about, I mean, I talked about, in 25 years, higher ed will be more mobile. which obviously it is becoming. I mean, meaning you don't have to go to a place to experience it. You can experience it where you are, and that's basically almost all of higher ed right now.
Right.
Um, that it's be more disaggregated. People don't always think about the fact that one institution tends to, it teaches you all the courses. You can't pick and choose among different institutions, but it also credentializes. If it's a residential college, it feeds and houses and entertains you. I mean, and you have to buy the entire bundle if you want any part of it. And over time, that will start to break up. You can see a bit of it in the MOOCs. The MOOCs actually didn't exist when I wrote the book, but I wrote about the concept of MOOCs, but they didn't yet exist at the time. I talked about how learning would be more personalized. There'd be more focus on learning outcomes. It'd be more accessible. It'd be more global, and it'd be cooler. That there are a lot of things that technology would enable. And I talked about all these things. I would say that we're moving at a steady pace along all of them, but ironically, I think we're moving more slowly on things like the focus on learning outcomes, the personalization of education. You would think that would be because it is the core of what a university does, that we would have made the most progress on that. I feel like we are actually lagging on those two elements relative to the others.
Yeah, it's interesting you point that out. I mean, obviously on the broad set of the seven certainties, right? Like a lot of those trends are playing out. Some much quicker than others. But I think that was a pretty good forecast into where we are today and where we're going. But you're right. On the learning outcomes, a focus on personalized learning. I mean, I feel like the last 10 years of the ASU GSV conference which is about how long it's been going. Like every session is about personalized education, AI powered learning, and so you would think that this, I don't know, the massive investment in ed tech and software solutions and other things that have really been focused on that would have brought us much further than we are now. But you're right. I mean, we're kind of stuck, and there aren't many people that would tell you that higher education from a learning outcome perspective is more efficacious today than it was 30 or 50 years ago, right? I mean, I don't know if they'd say it's worse, but I don't hear people saying, oh yeah, we are much better at the delivery of teaching, right, than we were, half a century ago. So how do you think we break out of that? Or do we?
I think that's the right way of thinking about it. Is a student who's graduated from a university today better educated than somebody who graduated 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago? And I think it's hard to make that argument. And in fact, the research around it suggests, if anything, maybe the opposite. Although these are hard things to compare. I don't want to. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are listening to this who are thinking, well, wait a second, on my campus, this is happening, or I'm working on this, and it's actually really cool. And that may well be true. Like there are a lot of great experiments going on. There are a lot of faculty who are really doing interesting things. The question is really, when does it seep into the model in such that every student is getting the benefit? And technology does permit a lot more use of data to inform instruction. You mentioned a great example of you talked about Tony Brown, but you can bring experts from around the world right into your classroom when you deliver something online. You're limited to who can actually show up in Lansing, Michigan, or Durham, North Carolina, or wherever, when in a traditional classroom. So I think people are seeing the world open up. There are web exercises and programs that you can use for students, and simulations that technology will permit, that will start to really advance personalized learning and ultimately learning outcomes. And I would just note that one of the problems with traditional education is each faculty member has his or her curriculum and outcomes, whereas typically in a well-designed online program, you get a number of faculty members and instructional designers and so on together to create a course with common outcomes, so you can start to compare who's doing better, who's doing worse. And the comparison serves not just as a way of scolding, but as a way of um, helping everyone improve. Like once like
Right.
any athlete or dancer or whatever, like you need somebody to say, you see how this person's doing, you need to do a little more like that. And it's a way of improving. And I think technology enables us to capture what's going on, both in terms of what's happening at the time and the underlying data that says how students are performing as a result.
Yeah. I mean, you and I have seen plenty of incredible technologies or other innovations that just haven't progressed because of other issues, right? Policies, deeply held beliefs that, just are ingrained in a culture of an institution, a whole bunch of things that can hold it back. We actually got a question from one of the folks joining us right now about, in your mind, what are the major reasons why it takes a full-blown crisis to drive the type of innovation that we're seeing in higher ed, right? Like what are the real barriers? Like you talked about incentives in your book. I mean, is that still one of those? But like what would you say are the big reasons why it takes in some cases a real catastrophe to drive innovation across higher ed?
Well, I could say this in a positive way or a negative way, but I've sometimes said like sometime in I don't know if it was the 1930s or 40s or something, like higher ed decided that it was perfection, that it was the best possible way of educating people. And once you've decided your perfection, that any change is necessarily worse. So uh, there's sort of an inherent belief that something that is different is probably worse. Now, it's not that it's necessarily worse, but it's probably worse, and that sort of presses back against innovation in higher ed. On the other hand, you know, you don't necessarily want uh, Harvard, 12 and then Harvard 13, Harvard 14 with complete pivots and total change because there is something special about what happens on a traditional college campus and you want to preserve it, but you know, higher ed is not immune from, opportunity to grow. But I think there are some, and this is, as you say, in Change.edu, I talked a lot about the incentives that exist on a campus. And there are different incentives, whether, for a traditional school, for a public school, for a community college, and for a for-profit institution. And none of them, and this is, a key point in the book, none of those incentive systems really align with what our society needs. They're all different from what society thinks it's getting in key ways, and none of them aligns perfectly.
Yeah, so one of the segues from like the barriers, the things that are holding it back. I mean, I like your point about if you view yourself as perfect or as the best or whatever, right? It's harder to kind of evaluate where you could change, and that's an interesting concept. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I do. I think higher ed suffers from that as it relates to innovation, though, right? Back on this subject of how innovation happens, where do you see innovation now in higher education, right? Like, where is it coming from? What are the most promising things, or I'll say people or stuff? So I'm just curious where innovation lives right now in the higher ed sector in your mind.
Yeah, good question. I've always felt like innovation comes from a sense of either opportunity or a sense of fear, right? That's where, you said it earlier, you said necessity is the mother of invention. It's a way of saying the same thing. The reason that Apple innovates the iPhone each year is because there's opportunity, big opportunity if they can develop a better product. Um, in higher ed, because of this sense of conservatism, and by that I don't mean political conservatism, obviously, but that things should, unless there's a good reason otherwise, remain the same. Uh, that sense of opportunity is muffled because anytime you try something, there's always going to be people who say, "Don't do that. You're diluting the quality. You're this," And so fear has really, I think, driven innovation in higher ed to a large extent. And increasingly, I think that's definitely what happened on March 11th or 12th, was fear.
Right.
We're out of business unless we adapt. And so, universities adapted very quickly. I think coming out of the pandemic, we're going to see an acceleration of a dynamic that's existed for a while, which is um, the financial models of a lot of institutions are going to be very strained, and that's going to enable institutions to do something very different. Having said that, if you go back through the history of higher ed, many of the great innovations have come because individuals have led organizations to becoming special. And Justin Morrow would be a great example of that. In that, he wasn't in the higher ed system, but he was in Congress and helped drive the land grant act. But you talk about people that we know well. I mean, obviously Mitch Daniels at Purdue. He has taken a university that already is, I think was innovative and sort of ahead of the curve, and focused it on, well, I guess I'd say about Mitch Daniels, about Michael Crow, about Nathan Hatch is somebody we work with. These are people who have somehow extricated themselves from feeling like they have to follow what the sort of the next highest ranked institution is in the firmament, and instead said, wait a second, what are we here for? What is our purpose? Why do we exist? And in the case of Purdue, Purdue's a land grant institution, and Mitch Daniels has said, our job is to serve the people of Indiana and the economy of Indiana and the country as a whole. And we're going to focus on what advances those goals. I think Michael Crow has said the same thing. He wants Arizona State to look like the state of Arizona, and he wants everybody who goes there to have comparable learning outcomes, meaning demographically. He doesn't want some populations to underperform relative to others. Well, once you start thinking about your job like that, as opposed to how can I be ranked a little bit higher in the next U.S. News rankings, well, that drives innovation, because what Michael Crow is trying to accomplish, or Mitch Daniels is trying to accomplish, can't be done the old way. You've got to say to people, this is the goal, and you're going to have to, we're collectively going to have to figure out a way to get there. And that's what really institutions that are most innovative to me are the institutions that know where they want to go and are focused on that goal, not on all the incentives to become, more selective or have faculties, that has, bigger credentials and so on. I mean, really, Brandon, I would push this question to you, because you actually, when you came to Kaplan, one of the things you said right from the start was, I want to only, because obviously we work with lots of universities, but you said, I only want to work with universities that have innovative leaders, ambitious leaders that want to grow. And so you actually have the best job in higher ed, which is to go out and talk to the coolest, most interesting, most dynamic leaders. I mean, where do you think innovation is coming from?
Yeah, well, you made an interesting distinction earlier about how you see innovation coming from two sources, right? The fear, or the necessity is the mother of all invention side, or the opportunity side. And as I was listening to you reflect on, the Michael Crows and the issues, and the Mitch Daniels and the Purdue's, and Nathan Hatch and Wake Forest, right? Those are all individuals that I would call opportunity-driven leaders,
Yes.
and institutions that, by the way, we're all brand name institutions, right? Before, those three leaders in particular, it wasn't like they were, just like, not even on the radar. But they looked at the opportunity to grow, right? Opportunities to serve more students, right? Where could they go in ways that were different from the rest of higher education, as opposed to mimicking it? And that's honestly where I think, as much as I'm happy to see the innovation coming from necessity and from fear, right? Like, I think that, but to think about, and this is my encouragement to universities now, is as fast as they can get out of the fear-driven innovation cycle, right? Even though it might be healthy and something that is needed, to try to put some energy towards the opportunity innovation side of things. Like, one of the things I've worried about most in the last 8 months for all leaders of all organizations, but especially higher ed, is just simply the fact that we're so consumed with the issues of the day, right? In the moment, right? Just trying to stay afloat. Pandemic, racial issues like we've never seen, a political climate that's as contentious as it's ever been. I mean, you can go on and on, right? And so what happens is there's very little time for leaders to reflect. There's very little time for leaders to look over the horizon, right? And where I see universities really moving in that opportunity side of things is they've actually carved out time and place and positions for innovation, right? So, for example, Wake Forest has an innovation committee on their board of trustees. They have a vice president of innovation. I see the same thing with Babson, a VP of innovation, right? These are institutions that have kind of named that innovation. And certainly an ASU, right? They've been doing that for a long time, and it's been recognized as the most innovative university for years. So that's my encouragement. And to your point, yes, I mean, yeah.
I completely agree with you, Brandon, that the examples we're talking about are opportunity-driven innovation. And I think what it says is if leaders can get out of the sort of the bubble that people push them into, which is you've got to do what another elite institution is doing, and say, let's back up and let's carve our own paths. There's a lot of room for you. I mean, really, if I think about, and that's my point, is across history, that's where the big innovations have really taken place, not the ones that are driven off of fear, although fear is what gets the volume. It's what becomes extraordinary is the opportunity driven. The only, I probably should say, but arguably Southern New Hampshire emerged when Paul LeBlanc took over an institution that was in trouble. Its future was not assured, and he was able to use that to do something quite special. So and I'll put it in the bucket of, I don't want to be quoted as saying that there was fear driven, but if you put it in that bucket, you would say he used that crisis to build something special at that institution. But that's less typical than what you'd find where the great institutions or the great leaders use opportunity.
Right, and maybe the hope is the stimulus of this. We've proven we can do it, meaning a big pivot because of the pandemic, right? Like everybody across higher ed is looking around, going, well, if you had said how long would it be before every faculty member in higher ed teaches online, if I had asked you that question 9 months ago, right, or any of the prognosticators, like it would have been somewhere between never and like 30 years, right? Yeah, and yet exactly. It happened in 3 days. And so, but the hope would be that even though there's a lot of reason to fear, institutions who are really on the financial brink, right, major headwinds in higher ed, that stimulus, right, if it's transitioned into where are the opportunities, where can we go, that I think I feel very optimistic for higher ed if people can start to shift their attention towards that, looking on the horizon. And speaking of looking on the horizon, I know we've got a lot of Kaplan folks joining us today, and a lot of folks who work with us across partner institutions here in the U.S. and around the world. I get the question a lot. I know you've gotten it, but maybe give us an update. How's Kaplan doing in the middle of the pandemic, and what's the latest on the Kaplan front?
Well, just in a short period of time, I guess I would say Kaplan came into the pandemic with some big advantages and some real challenges. The advantages, I'd say one big advantage is we've been in online education since the mid-90s. So there aren't a lot of organizations that have 25 years of experience at online education. And so, people who, where students no longer could go to a location, to one of our hundreds of locations around the country and around the world, we were able to shift them to online in a way that I think students found really effective, really powerful. And the number of students who stuck with us, we didn't really lose students. And in fact, we still have, students in a lot of programs who, they've now gone 8 months online when what they signed up for was an in-person experience, whether it's a higher ed experience or, a professional experience or whatever it might be. And so we were really able to bring to bear all that experience in a way that helped us a tremendous amount. The place where we've been challenged is that a big part of Kaplan, and I think not everybody in the U.S. at least understands it. A big part of Kaplan is bringing students from one country to another to study. So we bring, I think we bring more students into the U.S. to study than anyone else in the world, into the U.K., into Australia, into Singapore, um, into really most of the English-speaking countries in the world, from China, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria. Um, so when all of that traffic stopped, that's been a challenge. So we have a program where we bring students for English language for a few weeks or a couple of months. That business has been tough. On the other hand, our pathway programs, where we're bringing students for degree programs with partner institutions, those students have tended to stick around because that's part of a life, plan for
Right.
those students. So they're willing to wait it out online because they know the time will come when they can go get their program. So it's been a mixed bag, but I feel like overall the Kaplan, here I'm gonna say what a lot of companies feel, but I definitely feel it. The Kaplan team really stepped up and protected our students, protected the business, and I think I feel really good about how Kaplan has responded to this, and the kind of new opportunities that have emerged through exposure to this crisis. So so far so good on the Kaplan front. We still hope for a
Yeah.
vaccine, and let's get back to normal.
That's right. Yeah, everybody wants to get back to that place, and I know from my perspective, I've worked as a an entrepreneur in a startup, and tiny fragile states of affairs. When you're in the startup world, and you think of startups as the place where innovation happens, and indeed a lot does. But one of the things I've loved about my role at Kaplan is that we're inside a very well managed and financially stable organization all the way up through Graham Holdings in terms of how we think about it. And it's an organization that gives all of us that work for it the ability to think in decades, not quarters or even on an annual basis. And so, that actually also leads to lots of innovation. And some of the things that I've been most excited about at Kaplan have been things that we've worked in supporting the innovation of university partners around. So there'll be a lot more about that we'll have a chance to talk about. I appreciate you coming on the show today. I think we can cancel our bi-weekly meeting because I think we're all caught up. So, saving you time and energy on that front. For those of you who are interested, next week, I'm going to have John Kroger, who just stepped down as the Chief Learning Officer of the U.S. Navy, was also a former college president. We're going to be talking to him about a bunch of things next week. So please join us. Andy, once again, thank you so much for being on the show today. And I will talk to you soon, one way or the other, I'm sure.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate you having me. I look forward to seeing John Kroger next week.